The Central Intelligence Agency, better known to most of us as the CIA, has been the subject of some very unusual conspiracy theories over the years, many of which have been proven as true. Much of their work is kept a secret from the public, but when some of their documents are declassified, it usually makes for some very interesting reading. Number 10. On the 20th of July, 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first person to ever walk on the moon, an achievement that was once thought to be impossible. But almost a decade before that, in 1960, the CIA had plans to build a self-sustaining base on the moon, according to declassified documents. The idea was dubbed Project Horizon and was brought about thanks to the Cold War. One excerpt from these documents reads as follows, saying, quote, "To be second to the Soviet Union in establishing an outpost on the moon would be disastrous to our nation's prestige and in turn to our democratic philosophy. Since we'd never traveled to the moon, it seemed like a fool's errand to many people, but the CIA was convinced that it could be done, and before long they started outlining the specifications of the base and what it would be used for. It was decided that the base would have to be built underground, and that it would be a permanent installation where military personnel would be based. Furthermore, it needed to be completely self-supporting and large enough to comfortably accommodate soldiers who'd be spending long periods of time on the moon. But before this could be done, the moon had to be surveyed, and it was decided that 2 astronauts would be sent to the moon to do this before anything else was done. They would then remain on the moon until building crews arrived with the equipment needed to start the base's construction. One of the first things that would be needed was electricity. This meant that the first crews to arrive would have to build a nuclear reactor. Once this was done, other equipment, such as specialized space tractors, could be sent up. This tractor would serve several functions, such as digging trenches, moving heavy objects, and getting rid of any unwanted lunar material that might hamper construction. These factors were all seen as technically possible, since not all of this technology was available yet, but the CIA felt it would only take a few years before they could be developed. The plan was to have the base built and ready by 1965, at which time 12 people would be sent to the moon to start settling in. They would need rations of 3 quarts of water a day, but to do this, moisture would have to be collected from the atmosphere. It was thought that this would provide them with enough water to drink and do their laundry. They could also reuse the water they had drunk and used for laundry after it had been distilled. As for food, the plan was to set up a hydroponic garden where vegetables could be grown. These plants would also produce much-needed oxygen. The leftover vegetables could then be used to feed the chickens living on the base. They were thought to be the perfect choice since they thrive in confined areas. This would provide crews with meat and eggs, and soon they'd be able to breed fish and other aquatic animals such as mollusks that don't need much attention since they feed on algae. The documents also contained designs for spacesuits and medical facilities. It was decided that it should contain an area where patients could be isolated in case they had an infectious disease, and that allowance should be made for an area where surgery could be performed. These plans might sound like they're part of an elaborate sci-fi novel, but they were truly considered by the US government in the 60s. In the end, the first astronauts only landed on the moon in 1969, years after the base was supposed to have been completed. But the US took solace in the fact that they were the first to land humans on the moon, albeit 10 years after the Soviet Union first landed the Luna 1 spacecraft on its surface. Number 9. The subject of UFOs is one that is still hotly debated today, as many people claim to have seen extraterrestrial craft in the sky above our planet, and in some cases having interacted with the beings that were piloting them. In the past few years, the US Department of Defense has declassified several videos showing some of these unidentified aerial phenomena, and they took the world by storm. Some showed craft flying at unimaginable speeds and completing maneuvers that no earthly vehicle could perform. In other cases, they're seen flying in the air before suddenly diving below the ocean's surface without ever skipping a beat. There's no doubt that if this technology was ever developed here on Earth, the owning nation would have a massive upper hand during wartime, as far as the emergence of future technologies is concerned. In an effort to do this, the US government, along with the CIA and the Air Force, started working on Project 1794, the purpose of which was to create a flying saucer of sorts that could carry soldiers and outperform the fighter jets that were in use at the time. Work on the project started in 1950 with the aid of Avro Aircraft, a Canadian-based company. The craft was designed without any wings and instead would take off and land vertically without the need for a runway. If the project was successful, the craft would be able to reach speeds of up to Mach 4 and travel up to 1,000 nautical miles and soar up to 100,000 feet into the air. This meant that the craft would be able to land and take off virtually anywhere, something that would be invaluable in the midst of a war. Since it would be saucer-shaped, it would be much harder to detect by radar, making it possible to use the craft on missions where stealth was of the utmost importance. When these documents were declassified, they were found to contain designs for the craft, and they even referenced the fact that it would look like a flying saucer that had been seen in Hollywood movies. But these plans also included a few design flaws. When the VZ-9 Avrocar craft was built, it was found to be completely unreliable as soon as it rose more than 3 feet off the ground. It'd start to roll and pitch uncontrollably. It was predicted that it would be capable of flying at 300 miles per hour and at a height of 10,000 feet, but it only ever reached a height of a few feet and a maximum speed of around 35 miles per hour. Furthermore, wind tunnel tests showed that it was by no means aerodynamic, and in the end it turned out to be nothing more than just a glorified hovercraft. Number 8. The Cold War was fought from the end of World War II in 1945 until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. It was the result of differences in ideologies between communists and capitalists, as well as fierce competition between the US and Soviet Union's foreign policies. Some historians believe this war started earlier than 1945 and that it raged on long after 1991. But agree that one major factor to its outbreak was the fact that the US and Soviet Union simply didn't trust one another. It was during this time, specifically the late 1960s, that the US decided to construct a base in Greenland, which was called Camp Century. By all appearances, it was a research facility that was used by military scientists, but in reality, this was just a front for its true purpose. Declassified CIA documents would later reveal that the base was actually part of Operation Iceworm, a plan that was hatched to hide secret missile silos in case the Soviet Union decided to attack America. The project outlined plans for a series of tunnels to be drilled into the ice, after which the missile silos would be added. But before any construction could begin, several researchers were sent to the area to find a suitable site. They were supplied with massive drills that could drill through a mile of ice and the earth below. But as soon as this was done, the project ran into its first problem. Researchers discovered that the Greenland ice sheet was moving faster than anticipated, and that this would result in the missile silos being destroyed in just 2 years. The original plan was for up to 2,500 miles of tunnels to be drilled into the ice, but they never reached anywhere near this target, as the plan was abandoned with just 2 miles of tunneling completed. But the completed tunnels contained living quarters for the researchers, a kitchen, chapel, cafeteria, library, and a theater. In the end, these efforts cost the US government around $600,000, only for the project to be brought to a halt thanks to the shifting ice sheet. But it wasn't a complete loss. The 3 years of work proved that the tunnels would be capable of supporting up to 200 people at a time, and that a portable nuclear power plant could be used to supply them with electricity. Researchers also made another unexpected discovery. Plants found in the ice, along with sediment, showed that Greenland wasn't always the icy landscape that it is today, and that the ground was exposed for at least 10,000 years before being covered in ice once more. Number 7. The Gateway Experience may sound like a game show or a ride at a theme park, but in reality, the name is part of something far more intriguing, and in some people's opinions, sinister, since it involved the CIA and yet another clandestine operation. But before the Gateway Experience, which is what this operation was called, can be fully understood, one first needs to take a closer look at the Monroe Institute, which is known as a private organization that studies expanded states of human consciousness. The Gateway Experience was developed by the Monroe Institute, and according to declassified information, could teach chosen operatives certain techniques, such as astral projection and remote viewing. Astral projection is said to be the ability for someone to leave their own physical form, after which they can travel to different planes of existence, commonly known as an out-of-body experience, such as those often reported by people who pass away, but who are then brought back to life. As for remote viewing, it's the ability to use one's mind to see people or events that are happening far away, sometimes in another country. At one point, this technique was considered as a possible manner of espionage, since the remote viewer would be able to glean information without their life being put in danger. Thanks to declassified CIA documents, we now know that the Gateway experience utilized techniques such as binaural beats, meaning that beats were played in both ears, and hemispheric synchronization, which synchronizes the two hemispheres of the brain. This was thought to cause the subject to fall into an altered state of consciousness, possibly making astral travel and remote viewing much easier. When the CIA got wind of these techniques that were being used by the Monroe Institute, they immediately took an interest, as is revealed in a document entitled Analysis and Assessment of Gateway Process. But it should be noted that the CIA wasn't trying to prove that these techniques actually worked, as is claimed by many people, but rather they were investigating some of the claims made by the Institute. Reading through the document, it becomes clear that the CIA never claimed that these techniques were possible, despite the Institute's insistence that they had perfected these methods throughout years of study. These claims stated that once someone has undergone the Gateway experience, they would gain superior focus, strength, and understanding of how the two hemispheres of their brain could be used to alter their conscious state. When this was achieved, the person in question would be able to move their consciousness outside of their physical existence, making it possible for them to travel through time and space at will. While some of the techniques used, such as meditation and hypnosis, are well known, others are a little more outlandish. These include biofeedback, which is the brain's ability to control one hemisphere using the other, or the consciousness matrix, which teaches the subject that they are nothing more than a hologram that's attuned to the larger universe hologram. Furthermore, the documents reveal that the Monroe Institute teaches its subjects that consciousness is timeless, and hence it never begins or ends. This led to a serious misconception once these documents were released to the public, as some people erroneously thought that the CIA was promoting reincarnation, when that simply wasn't the case. Number 6. The end of the Second World War was hastened by the fact that the US dropped 2 atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on the 6th and 9th of August 1945. This prompted Japan to surrender, shortening the war by several years according to some estimates. Since these bombings were so effective, the US government immediately started looking into additional nuclear weapons options, but this meant that additional nuclear tests would have to be carried out and a suitable site found. It didn't take long for Bikini Atoll, a small ring of coral islands in the Marshall Islands chain, to be selected. The islands were under the US's control, and testing there would not disrupt any shipping routes since it was far enough out of the way. But it was close enough to a military base, meaning that bombers could take off, drop one of the explosives, and then return without any long journeys or delays. The islands also formed a natural lagoon where ships could be used as targets. But there was one problem. About 167 people lived in the area, and before any testing could be conducted, they needed to be relocated. The residents were informed of these plans and told that they would be moved by the military, but assured that this would only be a temporary inconvenience. They were told that the nuclear tests that would be conducted there were crucial in preventing further outbreaks of war, and eventually the leader of the group, a man called King Judah, agreed, stating that their fate was in the hands of God. What followed next was revealed by a series of declassified documents concerning Operation Crossroads, the plan to use Bikini Atoll as a nuclear weapons testing site in order to learn how Navy vessels would be affected by a nuclear blast. Once the residents of the islands were relocated, the first test was scheduled for the 1st of July, 1946. 95 ships were brought into the lagoon as targets, while a further 150 ships remained 10 nautical miles away in support. The first of the bombs was transported to the area by a B-29 bomber at 9 a.m. that morning. It released the explosive, but then things went awry. The first detonation took place 520 feet above the ships and about 2,000 feet from the intended targets. A few of the ships were damaged and sank, but the test was by no means successful. The second test was carried out on the 25th of July of that year, and this time the military used a different technique. The bomb was placed 90 feet below the water, and against everyone's expectations, resulted in an enormous bubble of hot gas that created a crater in the sea floor. Above the water's surface, a 94-foot tsunami erupted and lifted one of the ships that weighed 27,000 tons. Many of the other ships were now contaminated with radiation, 8 of which were scuttled. A third test was scheduled for April of the following year, but it was called off when it was decided that all necessary testing had been done, and that it would be a waste of resources. The military also couldn't build a permanent base or airstrip at Bikini Atoll, and so it was left abandoned until 1954, when hydrogen bomb testing was conducted at the site. Number 5. At the end of the 1950s and the start of the 60s, the US and Soviet Union were embroiled in a vicious competition to see who would win the space race. Each nation was adamant that it had the superior technology to pull off this feat, and that it would be the first to do so. The Soviet Union commenced its Luna 1 program on the 2nd of January, 1959, but it was a failure as the craft missed its target and failed to land on the moon. But Luna 2 would be much more successful, crashing uncontrolled onto the moon's surface on the 14th of September of that same year. Luna 3 was the first ever aircraft to take photos of the far side of the moon, completing its mission that October. In the meantime, the US was battling to keep up, having launched several of its own lunar missions that proved to be far less successful. Morale was starting to wane in the US as it became apparent that the Soviet Union was far ahead as far as lunar technology was concerned, and in an effort to catch up, the CIA devised a plan to keep a close eye on the Soviets' efforts, thereby learning as much as they could in order to improve their own technologies. To do this, electronic intelligence was employed. Soviet mission data was intercepted and then tracked, but to do this, the US had to estimate the dates and times of each of these launches. But once this was done, they would receive a wealth of information regarding the craft used, the power its thrusters possessed, and the peak altitude that it reached during the mission. But since no two missions were alike, the US was faced with a slew of variables that had to be accounted for each time a launch took place. It was then decided that more accurate data could be extracted from the hardware of one of the Luna spacecraft, but to do this, the US would have to intercept one of the Soviets' Lunik craft. As luck would have it, a Lunik upper stage containing a payload was being displayed during a world tour in 1960, giving the CIA the perfect opportunity to enact their plan. One night when the exhibition was closed, agents were able to gain access to the Lunik, and they confirmed that it was an actual craft rather than a model. They needed longer access without being caught, and so they arranged for the Lunik to be the last piece of equipment to be loaded onto a truck before being transported to a new city. Agents then followed the truck, dressed in civilian clothes, and eventually forced it to stop. The driver was taken to a hotel, and the Lunik was taken to a scrapyard that was surrounded by 10-foot-high walls. 2 agents studied and photographed the nose of the craft, while the other 2 did the same at the other end, learning as much as they could in the process. Parts of the craft were dismantled, photographed, and studied, including its antenna and engine cavity, which did not contain the actual engine. The mounting brackets, fuel tank, oxidizer tank, and other features were all photographed, and the photos were then successfully sent to be processed. When they learned all they could while working through the night, the agents put the craft back together, replaced a Soviet seal that had to be duplicated, and placed the crate back onto the truck. It was then loaded onto a train with the rest of the equipment, and the Soviets were none the wiser. This information helped NASA staff members determine which goals had to be set to catch up to the Soviet Union in the space race, and ultimately overtake them, which eventually they managed to accomplish. Number 4. Thanks to declassified documents, we now know the CIA was heavily involved in Cold War initiatives, one of which was called Operation Paperclip. As the Second World War was coming to an end, America and Britain started surveying occupied Germany for any and all technology that could be repurposed. This included military and scientific technology, as well as documentation relating to it. And to accomplish this, certain groups, including the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, started collecting these documents as well as interrogating some of Germany's top scientists that had been instrumental during the war. German research facilities were raided, and every possible piece of useful information was seized, using the Ausenberg list, a document containing the names of engineers and scientists who were valued for their work with the Third Reich. The list was found inside a toilet at Bonn University, and sensing an opportunity, the US government started implementing Operation Overcast, which was later renamed to Paperclip. Many of the people who were named on the list were located and brought to the US with their families in tow. Since the Cold War followed the Second World War, they were put to use in aid of the US since they needed to develop biological and chemical weapons, as well as more advanced rockets. Not only would these scientists help develop these items, their location to the US would ensure that this information would not be available to the Soviet Union. But the program came with a few conditions. President Harry Truman ordered that no members of the Nazi Party or their supporters were to be recruited, but the Office of Strategic Services, which would later become the CIA, along with the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, ignored this order. They started destroying or cleaning up incriminating evidence showing that some of the scientists were either supporters or members of the party, including their involvement in war crimes, since they believed it was far more important to have them on the American side, rather than seeing them defect to the Soviet side, where they could help develop technologies against the US. One of the recruited scientists was Wernher von Braun, who served as the director of an Army research center during the war. He was part of the team that developed the V-2 rocket and was obviously privy to a wealth of useful information. He and a few other scientists were stationed at Fort Bliss in Texas, where they worked as War Department special employees, while the US Army was working on new rocket technologies. Von Braun would eventually be named as the director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, where he would become involved with the development of the Saturn V launch vehicle that was used in the Apollo space program. When these documents were eventually declassified, many people were outraged that the government used these scientists for their own gain. But many others feel that it was justified, since it ensured that the US remained valid during the Cold War. But there is no denying that some of these scientists should have been brought to justice for the abhorrent crimes they committed during the Second World War. But thanks to Operation Paperclip, they were never tried and never will be. Number 3. When we think of war, our minds usually conjure up images of tanks, planes, foot soldiers, and in modern times, drones that can strike from great distances. But many wars have contained another element that's often forgotten about: psychological warfare. During the Cold War, one CIA agent took it upon himself to wage psychological warfare on communist rebels in the Philippines, having learned that people living in the country could be very superstitious, especially regarding a mythical creature called Aswang. The closest thing we have to an Aswang is a vampire, but the two are by no means the same creature. Aswangs are far less picky than our mythical vampires, as they're said to feed not only on humans, but also on animals like pigs. Furthermore, it can change form at will, often appearing in folklore as a massive dog, a man-sized vulture, or other animals. When one is seen, it's believed that a serious illness will soon befall the observer. This is usually followed either by their passing or by a string of unimaginably bad luck. They're said to perch on top of rooftops, where they unfurl a long tongue that snakes into the house to drain their unsuspecting victim of biological material. Among its preferred victims are the elderly, children, and pregnant women, who are unlikely to put up much resistance. The belief is still very prevalent in the Philippines today, but during the Cold War, the legend was put to good use. During the Second World War, Edward Geary Lansdale joined the military and served in the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA. He focused on propaganda campaigns, a role that fit him well since he had worked in advertising before the outbreak of the war. But following this, he was sent to the Philippines in 1950, and there he aided the Philippine government against a communist group called the Hooks that was attempting to overthrow the government. First, Lansdale ordered pilots to fly over the Hooks' territory while broadcasting Philippine curses that would, according to legend, affect anyone who aided the group. This had the desired effect, and some Hook soldiers had to surrender when they almost starved without aid from the villagers. When a group of Hook soldiers made camp outside a village, Lansdale ordered that a rumor needed to be spread that an Aswang was on the loose in the village. They then kidnapped one of the Hooks, ended his life, and punctured his neck after the fact to make it look as though he'd been attacked by the creature. He was then placed on a trail where the soldiers found him, and believing that the Aswang was still on the loose, they immediately retreated, leaving the village and its people to live peacefully. Number 2. Area 51 in Nevada is arguably one of the most discussed topics when it comes to conspiracy theories, since thousands of people believe it's where the US government houses not only alien spacecraft and technology, but actual extraterrestrials that have either been captured or work with the government. For decades, no one other than selected government employees and soldiers had any idea what the area was being used for, leading to a lot of speculation. The fact that it was shrouded in secrecy and heavily guarded only added more fuel to these speculations, and before long, some curious members of the public attempted to gain entry to the area, but with very little success. But many of these rumors were finally put to rest when the CIA declassified documentation containing information on Area 51, and upon its release, many ufologists were left disappointed. The document, which is entitled the Central Intelligence Agency and Overhead Reconnaissance, the U-2 and Oxcart programs, was released to the public in June of 2022, though some sections remain redacted. It mentions how the area was chosen by officials in 1955 when they flew a small plane over the Nevada desert, and upon reaching Groom Lake, spotted an airstrip at the Atomic Energy Commission Nevada Proving Ground that was used as a gunnery range during World War II. It was decided that the area would be ideal for testing U-2 spy planes and training the pilots who would fly them. As for the name Area 51, it's merely how this area is designated on maps. But this name was seen as being too formal, and instead those who worked at the site referred to it as Paradise Ranch. The site was readied for the first test flight that took place on the 4th of August, 1955, and upon proving to be suitable, was then used for this purpose for many years to come. But this wasn't its only purpose. As other spy planes were being developed, such as the Lockheed A-12 and D-12 Tagboard, they were also put through their paces at Area 51, as were their pilots. This explains why commercial airplanes are not allowed to fly over the facility, why civilians are not allowed anywhere near it, and why the entire area is blacked out on Google Maps. If anyone were to obtain photos or other information on these craft, it could spell disaster if that information were to fall into the wrong hands. The document goes on to discuss unidentified flying objects, but not in the manner that one would expect. It states that when testing of the planes started, it caused a massive increase in the number of reports from the public of UFOs in the sky, and very quickly people started speculating that hangars at the facility were being used to house spacecraft or extraterrestrials. This is largely thanks to the Roswell incident that occurred in 1947, and which resulted in a type of alien mania in the country for years to come. The planes that were being tested at Area 51 were ordered to remain over 60,000 feet, something that until then was unheard of. Seeing lights in the sky at that altitude would have caused some alarm among members of the public who'd never seen anything like it before, and hence started believing that the area was either being visited by extraterrestrials or that alien technology was being developed at the site by the government. This resulted in another operation called Blue Book seeing the light of day, and much of its findings are still cited by some ufologists as proof that extraterrestrials have visited our planet, and that the US government had knowledge of this. The declassification of these documents had quelled many a rumor about Area 51, but as is expected, not everyone is convinced. Some people, many of whom are conspiracy theorists, believe that not all the information about Area 51 has been declassified, and that there are still clandestine activities being carried out involving extraterrestrials. Number 1. Operation Argo, also known as the Canadian Caper, is yet another CIA operation that has been declassified in recent times. And documentation has revealed that it played a major part in the Iran hostage crisis that lasted from the 4th of November, 1979 to the 20th of January, 1981. At the time, the Iranian Revolution was in full swing, thanks to economic inequality, political repression, and social tensions under the rule of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. And during this time, the US embassy in that country saw many anti-American protests from the Iranian people. The Shah was eventually forced to flee the country as tensions only grew, and shortly after, on the 14th of February 1979, it was set upon and occupied by a group of Iranian guerrillas. More than 100 staff members were held hostage, but they were soon released when an agreement was made between the US and Iran's new ruler. This agreement, though, would be broken just 8 months later, when Pahlavi, the previous Shah, learned that he was suffering from cancer and traveled to the US to receive treatment. This prompted an attack on the US embassy in Iran, and again its staff, 66 in total, were taken hostage. But the 6 US State Department employees managed to avoid capture and made their way to the houses of Canadian embassy officers, where they then hid. They then became known as the Canadian Six, and a plan had to be hatched to retrieve them. This became known as the Iran hostage crisis, and to resolve it, the CIA implemented Operation Argo, so named after the story of Jason and the Argonauts from Greek mythology. With the aid of the Canadian government, Canadian passports were issued in the names of the 6 hostages, and a fake company called Studio 6 Productions was created. The company announced that it was working on a new production called Argo, the ship that was featured in the famous tale of the Golden Fleece. A script was created that not only included Middle Eastern sci-fi themes, but also glorified the Islam faith, and one of the hostages was listed as the author under the name Tessa Harris, a pseudonym. Disguises and fake documents were then sent to Iran, where they were then received by the hostages at the Canadian embassy. 2 CIA agents then traveled to the country pretending to be location scouts for the film, and once there they met up with the hostages to lay out the plan that they were about to enact. The 2 agents and 6 hostages then traveled to the Tehran airport, dressed in their disguises and with their fake documents in hand. Since it was very early in the morning, security at the airport was lax, and the group managed to board the plane without any issues. They traveled to Zurich, from where they were finally free to return home, finally concluding one of the most elaborate rescue operations that the CIA has ever performed. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.